Welcome back to Fundamentals in Ecology, where today we will be talking about species interactions. My name is Umesh Srinivasan, and I am from the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science. You would have heard the term species interactions over and over again in the context of ecology, and how species interactions are very important in determining the structure and the function of ecological communities. Right, so let's talk about some of these interactions today. If you look at a pair of species, species A and species B, and then you ask what effect does species A have on species B, and vice versa, what effect does species B have on species A, then depending on whether the effect that a species has on the other is positive, negative, or neutral, that it does not have any effect on the other species, and the other way around, we can classify species interactions into various types. Competition is a word that is often heard in the context of ecology, and competition is a kind of interaction between two species where both of them have mutually negative impacts on each other. So if the population size of species A increases, it causes a reduction in the population size of the population growth rate of species B. If the population size of species B increases, it causes a negative impact on the population size and the population growth rate of species A. And competition is a very common ecological interaction. Two species might be competing for the same kind of food, two species might be competing for the same kind of resources like nesting sites, and so if species A increases in abundance, then it consumes more of the resources that are being competed for, therefore reducing the amount of resource available for species B, and the other way around as well. When one species has a negative impact on the other, but it does not affect the second species, that is a kind of interaction called an amensalism. If you think about, for example, a large mammal like an elephant walking through the forest, and while it walks through the forest, it crushes insects, or it crushes the eggs of a ground nesting bird, then there is a significant negative impact to the insect or that ground nesting bird because of the elephant, but it does not matter to the elephant, right? There's no effect of that interaction or that species on the elephant. That's a neutral interaction. And so this kind of asymmetric interaction is called amensalism. When one species has a negative impact on the other, and the other species has a positive impact on the first, that is an example of an antagonism. Examples of antagonisms are predation and parasitism. So the malarial parasite, by colonizing a host, is actually gaining a benefit, right? It's gaining the ability to reproduce, but it's harming the host. That kind of parasitism is harming the host, it's reducing the fitness of the host. Similarly with predation, whatever gets eaten obviously immediately loses fitness, right? Whatever is eating the prey is gaining in fitness, and we will talk about competition and predation and how these structure ecological communities. So competition and predation actually were the two most well studied ecological interactions, and a lot of theory in ecology and community ecology comes from saying, here's how important competition is in structuring communities, here's how important predation is in structuring communities. Because of competition and predation, the fundamental niche will always be larger than the realized niche, and so on. So these are kinds of concepts that we've got from competition and predation. Whereas there is a class of interactions where two species can have positive impacts on each other, right? So if species A has a positive impact on species B has a positive impact on species A, that kind of interaction is called a mutualism, right? Examples are Mullerian mimicry and sometimes herbivory. So Mullerian mimicry, as you see with those two butterflies on the top right corner there, is a form of interaction where you have two species, both of which are toxic. So they're poisonous. If a predator eats one of these two species, it will either fall sick or it might even die. Now, what these two toxic species have evolved to become is to look more similar to each other. And so, if a predator tries to eat one of the individuals of one species A and then falls sick, then that predator knows that another species that looks like that, another individual that looks like that, is probably not okay to eat for it. And so therefore one species is helping the other by training the predator to avoid similar looking prey. And that happens the other way around also. The predator could have been trained on an individual of species B and then learnt to avoid individuals of species A. So that's one example of a mutualism. In some cases, grazers, when they graze, when they actually eat grass, they actually increase the growth rate of those grasses. And so in those situations, the grazer also benefits from food, and the grass also benefits from an increase in population growth rate. Where you have the opposite of amensilism, amensilism is where one species has a negative impact on the other and the other species has no impact on the first. In a commensalism, you have a positive impact of species A on B, but no effect on the other species. This is called a commensalism. Some examples are our cities, and we build structures that benefit species like pigeons because they get areas to nest in. And so that need not have any impact on us, the presence of those pigeons, but it does definitely a positive thing for the pigeon species as a whole. And so that is an example of a commensalism. When there are two species that basically are not interacting, they don't have any effect on each other, that's what is called a neutralism. So you could have two species, both of which are present in the same habitat, but they actually don't interact with each other. That's a neutralism. So the way in which this is measured is that you would ask, if you increased, and this is the schematics that you're seeing on the right side of this slide here, if you increased the frequency of a species or the abundance or the density of a species on the x-axis, so going from low abundance there to high abundance here, what is the effect that will have on the relative fitness between these two species? So if you increase the frequency of species A, basically you're increasing the population size of species A, what will be the relative effect on the fitness of species A versus fitness of species B? Another way to think about this is to ask, if you have two species and you increase the population size of one, what is the effect that has on the per capita growth rate of species 2? So if you remember, if you recall the population ecology module, in that there is this density dependent growth that follows a logistic pattern, and there what happens is, as you keep increasing the number of individuals of in that population, as that number starts to become close to carrying capacity, the growth rate comes down of the population. And in fact, as you increase the abundance of a species, the per capita growth rate actually comes down linearly. And so if you have on an x-axis you have population size, x-axis you have population size, y-axis you have per capita growth rate, that relationship is linear and negative. And so you can ask, if I add one individual of species A to this community, what is the effect that has on the per capita growth rate of species B? And if that effect is positive, then that is a facilitative interaction. That could be commensalism or it could be a mutualism. If that effect is negative, then that could be either because of predation or because of competition. And we will talk in more detail about predation and competition in upcoming lectures. And so the way in which to conceptually think about this is to say, what is the effect of adding one individual of species A on the per capita growth rate of species B, and that tells us something, and the other way around, what is the effect of adding one individual of species B on the per capita growth rate of species A, and that tells us what the nature of that interaction is, whether it's competition or whether it's predation or and so on. This is very difficult to do in practice in the field, to estimate population growth rates. For example, if you're working in a tropical rainforest and you're studying birds, this is a very difficult thing to do. But in laboratory conditions, one can manipulate things like the abundances of some species and see what its effect might be on the growth rate of another species. So if you had to classify species interactions and how that affects community structure, you can talk about these interactions as being top down, bottom up, or lateral. Top down and bottom up interactions involve eating and being eaten, right? So it's across trophic levels, could be predator, prey, and then a primary consumer, and then a producer. There are certain communities in which predation operating from the top of that food web has a very strong impact on the community structure at lower trophic levels. When that happens, this is called keystone predation. In other communities, the role of resources, the availability of resources might be more important in influencing how many individuals there are of different species, what are the population sizes of different species in the community. And therefore, that is a bottom-up effect, where going from the lower trophic level to the higher trophic level actually has a bigger impact than the other way around. And then there are lateral processes that operate within a trophic level. These could be things like competition and facilitation, where a species is not eating the other, or species not infecting another, but maybe they're competing for the same resources, or maybe they're helping each other access the same resource. And one good example of facilitation again is coral, where there are two species in that interaction. Each of them alone would not have been able to live where they can live when both of them enter into a facilitative or a mutualistic interaction. Let's look at some of these top-down effects across trophic levels and the role of keystone predation. So here you have three trophic levels. You have, at the lowest trophic level, you have a primary consumer, which is this mussel here. At one trophic level higher than that, you have the cow-nose ray, which is which feeds on these mussels. And the apex predator in this system that feeds on the cow-nose ray is the black-tip reef shark. Now, these are data that come from off the coast of the state of Florida in the United States. Since about 1970, there was a lot of fishing for reef sharks. And so a lot of the population of reef sharks collapsed going from 1970 to about 2005. In 1970, the abundance was some value, and relative to that value, the abundance has almost declined to zero by 2005, and that's because of people fishing these reef sharks. As the abundance of these reef shark declines, the abundance of the cow-nose ray goes up, and that is because there is no more predation happening. Predation was what was keeping cow-nose ray populations in check, keeping cow-nose ray populations at a certain level. Here, the cow-nose ray populations were not really being influenced by what they were eating, the primary consumer, but influenced by the fact that they were being eaten by an apex predator. And as cow-nose ray populations increased, the population of the primary consumer, this mussel, decreased in response to that. So what you are seeing here is something called a trophic cascade. Yeah. So you remove the apex predator, you remove that top predator, and then the effects of that cascade through subsequent trophic levels, and that is called a trophic cascade. And in the presence of keystone predation, and when those keystone predators are removed, is when you see trophic cascades. Another instance of top-down effects being important in structuring communities is something called mesopredator release. A lot of concepts in community ecology have been tested in this island called Barro Colorado Island. Barro Colorado Island is in Panama, and when the Panama Canal was built, linking the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, the sea obviously came into what was earlier forest land, and then inundated the lower parts of that canal, but the upper parts of the mountains, the mountain tops, were left were not underwater. They were left above water, and they formed islands. And one of those islands is a large island called Barro Colorado Island. And a lot of work, and we will see other work that's also been done from Barro Colorado Island about very, very fundamental concepts in community ecology. So what happens with the formation of Barro Colorado Island is that this island is now too small to support a population of jaguars. Right? The jaguars need a certain minimum habitat size to be able to persist, to be able to exist in, and because of the fact that Barro Colorado Island was smaller than that critical size, jaguars disappeared from this forest. Jaguars were preventing the activity and lowering the abundances of what are called mesopredators, or middle-sized, mid-level predators. These are things that are smaller than the jaguar, cats like the ocelot, the jaguarundi, and species like the coati. These are species that then feed, these are species that feed on the nests of birds, these mesopredators. If they find a nest they'll feed on the eggs or the nestlings of the species. Now, because the jaguar has come down in abundance in Barro Colorado Island, what's happened is that these mesopredators have become more active or have increased in their abundances. And if you compare the percentage of nests on the y-axis that have been eaten or predated upon in the mainland and this island, Barro Colorado Island, at different heights. So you've got birds that nest on the ground, 0 meters above the ground, birds that nest 1 meter above the ground, birds that nest 2 meters above the ground. On the mainland, where the jaguar is present and keeping these mesopredators activity levels low, there's only about 5% nest predation on nests that are on the ground. But if you remove the jaguar and the activity of these predators increases, then what you've got on the fragment where this is happening is that 90%, about 90% of the nests that are on the ground are being predated upon. And then you have some amount of nest predation that you did not have on the mainland, but you have on nests that are 1 meter and 2 meters high above the ground. Now, the jaguar is not interacting directly with these birds, right? But several bird species have gone extinct on Barro Colorado Island because of the absence of the jaguar and the release of mesopredators. And so, this predation can have unexpected and indirect ways in which it functions as well, structuring communities that are not necessarily interacting with one of the main players structuring this community, right? So, the fact that several bird species have gone extinct from Barro Colorado and are no longer part of that community is because of the removal of the jaguar, which was not directly interacting with them. It was not eating any of these bird species. Let's look at bottom-up effects. These are effects across trophic levels again. Some decades back, a fungus called the chytrid fungus went around the world. It was transported around the world, presumably by human beings. And this chytrid fungus was deadly for amphibians, frogs, toads, and so on. So, chytrid fungus actually worldwide caused a dramatic decline in the abundances of frogs and amphibians, the abundances of frogs and toads. What you're seeing on the left is a frog that has been infected with chytrid fungus, and on the top right a picture of the spore of the chytrid fungus there. In some places, like in some locations in Central and South America, chytrid fungus actually led to a 75% abundance decline of amphibians. So if there were 100 individual amphibians in that location before chytrid fungus hit, now there would be only 25 amphibians in that area. And in some places where these abundances have dropped by about 75%, 30 species have been locally made extinct. They have gone locally extinct. And so this is a huge dramatic drop in amphibians which are prey for snakes. Now snakes have not been affected, are not infected by chytrid fungus, but you've got these 4 species of snakes here, and what you've got is some measure of body condition of these snakes before and after chytrid fungus causes this collapse in amphibian populations. And you can see in all of these species, body condition before is higher than body condition after chytrid fungus hits. So body condition measured in some way, which is mass to surface area ratio, declines for these snake species that are dependent on these amphibians after chytrid fungus hits this amphibian community. And in fact, what happens when this bottom up effect is seen is that the composition of the snake community changes pre and post chytrid fungus. So you've got pre chytrid fungus, the composition of snake communities in this ellipse, and post chytrid fungus, the composition of snake communities in this ellipse. The way to interpret this particular graphic is that if two communities are close to each other, like these two, then they are composed more similarly. They have a more similar composition than if two communities are farther apart. Two communities are different, are distant in these dots. So every dot represents one community, and the distance between those dots represents one snake community, and the distance between those dots then tells you whether those two communities are very similar or very dissimilar in terms of the composition and the abundances of the snakes in those communities. Before chytrid fungus hits, what you've got is several snake communities that are quite different from each other. There's quite a lot of heterogeneity, there's quite a lot of variability in snake communities in this area before chytrid fungus hits. But after chytrid fungus hits, the snake communities start becoming more similar to each other, and they occupy a much smaller space. They're becoming homogenized. That's what's happening with these snake communities, that in the absence of the amphibians, the space occupied by snake communities, the variability of snake communities from one location to the other has come down. That's reduced. And so this is an example of how a bottom-up effect, which is that the availability of resources affects through body condition, and we've seen how that body condition is being affected here. Through its effect on body condition, it is then affecting how snake communities at a higher trophic level are changing in composition because of the collapse of prey. And now we've looked at some top-down effects and some bottom-up effects. What we will talk about in detail now and the next time will be lateral effects, which is within a trophic level, which is things like competition and facilitation, where you have these starlings and this groundhog, and the starlings are competing for the same food, but there is no interaction here in which one participant is preying upon or eating another participant. So these interactions are interactions between species within a trophic level, interactions of species that belong to the same trophic level and feed on the same things. So the next time we meet, what we will be talking about is competition, right? Competition, the interaction in which two species have mutually negative effects on each other, right? So species A affects species B negatively, species B affects species A negatively, and the addition of an individual of species A is expected to have an impact on the population growth rate of species B, and an addition of an individual of species B is expected to have a negative impact on the population growth rate of species A. And so we'll see what the various types of competition are in nature and how the strength of competition can actually influence the structure of communities and the function of communities. So thank you very much for joining, and see you next time.